Okay, so thanks very much, Doug, for that kind of introduction, and thank you to Rob for the invitation to the talk tonight. Nice to see some familiar faces as well. So what I'm going to talk about today, my voice holds up, and I assure you it is not COVID, I just have laryngitis from human lectures. What I want to talk to you about today are a few things that I've been thinking about recently with respect to how we evaluate risk in the context of public health in the context of a pandemic. So I'm sorry, this is yet another COVID talk. I'm sure there have been many. But if there is any silver lining, it's that it provides us with much food for ethical thought. And the work that I'm talking about today has also been done under the auspices of the UK Pandemic Ethics Accelerator funded by UKRI. So it's going to be a talk in 3 parts today. So first I'm going to talk about challenge trials. So some of you may have come across this concept. Challenge trials are the deliberate infection of human participants with an infectious agent, in this case COVID, for the purposes of research. And I'm going to be asking whether the risks are ethically justified, with particular reference to the challenge trials that are currently going on in the UK. I'm then going to move to something else that I've been thinking about, which is the differential allocation of different vaccines to groups of population, groups of patients, based on their risk profile. So in particular, I'm going to look at the way in which decisions were made around which vaccine was allocated to which groups in the UK, and some of the risks that were talked about in relation to the AstraZeneca vaccine, and question what factors differential vaccine allocation should be based on. And then I'm going to try and bring those two things together to present us with some considerations for how we think about risk and relative risk in setting public health policy across this whole area. So I'm going to attempt to argue that at least some forms of challenge trials are not ethically justified. I'm going to argue that stratifying populations for vaccine allocation by their risk profile can in some cases result in unjust distribution of risk. So we shouldn't be doing that. And then I'm also going to say that comparing these cases and looking at the ways in which they have used relative risk to make public health decisions reveals some flaws in our overall approach to pandemic public health. So that's an overview of how I hope the talk's going to go. Okay, so the first part of the work that I'm going to talk about is something I've been working on with a PhD scholar and research assistant at Edinburgh, Emma Nance, who's been working with me as a student on the One Health Models of Disease PhD program, and also doing some RA work with the Pandemic Ethics Accelerator. So Emma has conducted the literature review and synthesis of the ethical issues, and has also done some work developing arguments with me on challenge trials and whether they're justified, just to make that clear. So what are challenge trials? As I said, challenge trials involve the deliberate exposure of participants to an infectious agent. So they're also known as controlled human infection trials. I'm going to be referring to them as challenge trials, or CT for short. And the idea of challenge trials has been hotly debated, particularly over the last year. In particular, the idea of challenge trials as a tool for vaccine development has received quite a lot of ethical attention. So with respect to COVID particularly, the idea is that if you are trialling a vaccine and you have to wait for people simply to become infected or not, the lack of control over those situations means it's going to take longer and require both more time and more people to see what the effect is. On the other hand, if we take vaccinated participants and we deliberately expose them to infection, then we can see, hopefully in a much shorter time, how effective a given vaccine is. So that the idea there is that they will expedite the development of vaccines. And of course, given that an effective vaccine against COVID is something that from the outset has been one of the public health goals, we know that vaccination reduces the disease burden, results in lives saved, etc. The argument has been that, in fact, we need to conduct vaccine challenge trials in order to speed up the development of the vaccine. And I think estimates have ranged from several in the thousands or hundreds of thousands of lives that could be saved were we to speed up vaccine development even by a few months. So challenge trials have also previously been applied in the cases of a number of other diseases, and the ethics of this has also been hotly debated. COVID is perhaps not like some of the other diseases for which challenge trials have been conducted in the past for reasons that I'll go into. So what are some of the ethical considerations in relation to challenge trials or controlled human infection? As I said, the prime justification cited in favour of carrying out challenge trials is their social and their scientific value. So it's argued that we'll be able to build knowledge about disease, about the mechanics of infection, about the progression of the disease, about immune response, about transmission dynamics and so forth. And that both through increasing our understanding of disease biology and immune response, but also with that specific aim of challenge trials for vaccinated individuals, we will be able to accelerate the development of vaccines, we'll be able to accelerate the development of therapies, and we'll save lives. So the classic moral imperative. Now, of course, the big objection, oops, too many buttons at once. The big objection to challenge trials is that they pose a risk to participants. So you're going to take a bunch of people and deliberately infect them with something known to be harmful, known to be dangerous. So the major objection is, well, hang on, it involves a risk to participants, and not just a risk, because of course, as with ethicists, we know that everything involves some degree of risk, but the query is about whether the benefits that are claimed on the basis of these trials would justify the risks that will be imposed. So it's been argued that it's questionable whether the benefits of these trials will actually manifest. So even if we are able to speed up vaccine development, will we actually gain the benefit of that? It's dependent on factors including whether vaccines having been developed are efficiently produced and distributed. We might actually, depending on where and how challenge trials are carried out and where and how that expedites the development of vaccines, we might face further problems of justice and widening inequities in terms of who has access to the vaccines. I think there is a particular question over whether and how vaccine candidates, once tested, become distributed. So there are questions over whether the claimed benefits, the social and scientific value, will actually manifest. Beyond this, there's the ethical problem of researchers intentionally causing harm. So if we think about the progress of a vaccine challenge trial, we can split it into two steps. The first is the administration of the vaccine candidate. Now that, of course, is also a risk, because one of the things that we're looking at when we test new vaccines or new drugs is safety. So there's a risk involved in that. But we hope that the payoff, the benefit, is inducing immunity. So there's both the scientific and wider social benefit of developing a therapy, but we also hope that there will be some benefit to the person immunized of becoming immune to the disease. Once we've got to the point of having administered the vaccine, however, further exposing participants to the infectious agent can be nothing but harmful. So there's absolutely nothing in that for them. And Emma has worked particularly on a paper of her own, considering whether researchers are authorised. So is it legitimate for researchers to intentionally cause harm through the second step of the process where they expose the participants to the infectious agent? And she argues that actually for a number of reasons, we shouldn't see researchers as being authorised to do this. I don't have the quote from what she's written up here, but she says something like, people may volunteer to become firefighters, but that doesn't mean we should go about setting fires. Okay, there are, I think, a wider range of issues around the intentional infliction of harm by researchers that I think raise serious ethical problems. I won't go in depth into them here, but further justifications. So we might say, well, it's dangerous, there's too much risk to participants, we don't know if the benefits are certain, and you're deliberately causing harm to participants. Supporters of challenge trials would turn around and say, yes, but they volunteered for it, they consented to it. And the arguments that were raised, particularly in the UK, around whether we should allow healthy young people to volunteer to be infected with COVID as part of challenge trials, also focused very much on the idea of altruism and the idea that people may want to do something good. If they want to do something good, shouldn't they be allowed to? So defenders of challenge trials would say informed consent means that the risks and the harms involved are acceptable. They might also say, well, let's see what the risks actually are. And it has been argued that the risks involved in participating in a challenge trial fall within the threshold of what might be considered an acceptable risk. So there's a range of literature out there, again, on what acceptable risk is in the course of research. And I think particularly when it comes to risk-benefit balance, partly this is going to be an empirical question about how risky actually is it? What are the dangers of being exposed to and infected with a particular disease? Now, with COVID, some of those risks are increasingly known. So the argument has been that it's fewer than 1 in, I think, 3,000 healthy young people are likely to die from or have serious ill effects from COVID, and so that's a very small risk. But we might say that, well, actually, given the newness of this disease, given how much there is that we still don't understand about the disease progression and especially its long-term consequences, that in fact we can't claim that it is within the threshold of acceptable risk, and furthermore we can't really say that people are given informed consent because the understanding of risk that we have and what the risks and potential harms are is insufficiently well characterized. So simply telling people you have only a 0.03 chance of death doesn't take into account what the other risks might be, what other harms are not accounted for, particularly things like long COVID. Against that, again, proponents of challenge trials might say, yes, but we're reducing the risk as much as we can by selecting young, healthy subjects. So we know that younger people, people without pre-existing or other health conditions, are much less likely to die as a result of COVID. And yes, I think that reduces the risk, but then it also brings up another point of fairness. So is it right that young, healthy people sacrifice themselves in order to produce knowledge that may save the lives of other people? Okay, so in reviewing the wide range of literature that's out there on the ethical considerations around challenge trials, and particularly those that emerged around vaccine challenge trials, in other words, where you vaccinate people and then see if they become infected and so forth. A range of conditions under which challenge trials or controlled human infection would be considered ethically acceptable have emerged. So amongst those include the idea that, that subject selection is fair, that the risk-benefit balance is appropriate, that consent is given, and that there's stakeholder engagement. And again, this is from the literature review produced by Uehiro this year. So in terms of fair subject selection, I think there are serious questions about fairness in this context. So Uehiro, for example, has proposed that we should reduce both the risk itself by selecting young, healthy adults, but that we can also compensate the risk of participating in a way by selecting those subjects who are already at a high baseline risk. In other words, if you're already 50% likely to become infected with COVID in a given period of time, giving you a 100% chance of COVID is not as much of a risk to you as it would be were you to take someone who has very little chance of being exposed to COVID and then expose them. So again, this is about relative baseline risk. And we're going to see this issue appear again when we talk about vaccine allocation. Because of course, if you think about taking those populations who are more at risk of being infected with COVID in the first place, you can see that we're probably going to end up disproportionately targeting perhaps disadvantaged communities, those who work in roles where they have a high risk of exposure, often in more insecure socioeconomic situations, etc. So I think there's very much a question there over whether the proposals to mitigate the risk exposure are going to result in unfair subject selection. I think there are also problems with saying we're going to mitigate risk by focusing on the healthy young adult population in terms of the validity and applicability of the scientific knowledge. So how much can we extrapolate about disease progression, about immune response, about the effectiveness of vaccines for the whole population when we've only targeted young healthy adults for the experiments. We know very much from looking at clinical trials and subject selection over the past several decades that subject selection has resulted in the generation of knowledge that isn't necessarily applicable across the population. In other words, we have knowledge gaps when it comes to underrepresented sections of the population in clinical research, so children, pregnant women, minority ethnic groups, etc. So is the result of the research actually going to be valid when we've concentrated just on a certain specific population for recruitment? When it comes to evaluating the risk-benefit balance, as I said, there are questions over whether the benefits will actually be realised, whether the risk is acceptable. Furthermore, the risk-benefit balance has to take into account whether there might be other ways of generating that knowledge. So all things considered, would there be less risky ways or ways of generating that knowledge that have a more favourable risk-benefit balance? Again, some have argued that standard clinical trials without infection challenge would actually pose a more favourable risk-benefit ratio in this case. And once again, that's likely to come down partly to an empirical evaluation of the risk-benefit factors. I think when it's, so the other conditions, I talked about consent and about whether informed consent can truly be possible in the case of a new and largely uncharacterised disease. But I think another important factor that was identified as necessary for challenge trials to be ethical is stakeholder engagement. And I think we need to consider seriously the possibility that such trials might have the potential to compromise trust in science and healthcare. In other words, the kind of engagement that we might generate is actually going to be a negative one. And that might be the case either if someone suffers an adverse event as the result of participating in a trial, so the vaccine isn't effective, they contract COVID and they have serious ill health or death as a result. But in fact, in itself, the fact of researchers intentionally inflicting harm on participants, so that the fact of challenge trials themselves might be something that could compromise trust in science or healthcare. Okay, so that's the sort of ethical background for the discussion. As I said, the ethical discussion around COVID challenge trials intensified particularly last year. In November 2020, we had a few kind of media and blog pieces, this one's from the Science Museum, asking, should we infect young people with COVID-19? And in this piece, they go into some of these ethical concerns, but overall, and Julian Savulescu is quoted in this, they come down very much on the side of, because of the scientific and social benefits, because of the public health benefits and the lives saved, we ought to conduct challenge trials. In February this year, the first human challenge trials for COVID were approved in the UK. So that's the gov.uk press release. Interestingly, although a lot of the justification in November was around we must do this in order to develop vaccines, the first studies that were approved were not actually vaccine trials. So they weren't taking vaccinated people necessarily. They were aimed not at testing the efficacy of vaccines. And remember, by February, we already had a number of vaccine candidates becoming available and being rolled out. They were instead intended to establish characteristics of the coronavirus, such as the minimum amount of virus needed to establish infection, to look at transmission dynamics, to examine the duration of infection, to look at immune response, etc. So from what I understand, that was the aim of the first set of challenge trials to actually receive approval. So let's look at this scenario more specifically then, particularly in the way that risk and benefit have been evaluated in approving these trials. So once again, the overwhelming claim and support of carrying out challenge trials is that the benefit of these experiments justifies imposing the risks on participants. And I think the first trials were, I think about 90 people were scheduled to be deliberately infected with COVID. So I am not convinced, as you can probably tell, that the risk-benefit evaluation in this case was correct. I wondered whether it's actually necessary. So is it necessary to expose participants to these risks in order to realise the benefits of understanding more about the disease? And particularly if we think in February, in a context where there were thousands of new infections already occurring every day. is it actually necessary to go and infect 90 more people in order to gain that data? Could we not instead have used more real-world evidence in order to generate these results across a more diverse population in a real-world context? I think the actual public health benefits of this research also needed to be further clarified. So, for example, is quantifying the exact viral load required to reduce infection in a controlled environment likely in any way to influence public health policy in a beneficial way? So if we find out that that 1,000 instead of 100 virus particles are required, or 10,000 instead of 1,000 are required, even if we establish the order of magnitude, are we going to be able to say based on that, well, social distancing should go to 1.5 meters instead of 1 meter? What practical difference are we going to introduce into public health policy that comes from quantifying that exact viral load, given all of the messiness and the variability of real world situations? How does the data from that very controlled environment, how is that going to translate into public health policy in a timely way so as to actually save the lives claimed? Similarly, when it comes to studying transmission dynamics, my understanding of these studies were that they didn't plan to infect people and then release them back into the community, release them into the wild, but instead to keep them isolated so they didn't see even more COVID infections. But of course, again, what we want to understand when it comes to public health is how is this disease behaving, what's happening with the epidemiology in the real world. So is it the case that studying transmission dynamics in a very carefully controlled group of people in an isolated environment going to give us that understanding? Or would we be better off looking at the thousands of real world cases, devoting more evidence, for example, to things like contact tracing and understanding real world transmission? As I said, I think the challenge trials pose certainly further risks to public trust in science. And this to me is one of the most compelling reasons that there might not be a favourable risk-benefit balance. Because recall, the risk-benefit balance, the benefits are that we understand the disease better, we develop vaccines faster, we develop therapies faster. That only results in a public benefit if there is actually uptake of those vaccines. Now, either if adverse events occur, or if people get the idea that scientists are deliberately infecting people with COVID and that's a bit of a worry, compromising trust in science, which has already become increasingly fragile during this pandemic, is probably going to lead to further health harms. So if it makes 10% of people less likely to have a vaccine because they don't trust what scientists are doing in the development of vaccines, if people refuse to have vaccines because they don't want to have something that's been tested by deliberately trying to infect people, that's actually going to damage rather than improve public health. I think there's also a question over the timeliness of these trials, or rather the lack thereof. Vaccines were already starting to become available from late 2020, so that the justification of we need challenge trials in order to speed up the development of vaccines, certainly not the first wave of vaccines. And although we know that there are questions over different variants of coronavirus emerging and the efficacy of the vaccines that we currently have, the testing that was being done in those early phases was, of course, with the variants that were available, the variants of the virus that were available. So it's questionable whether that's going to be useful to, if you like, future-proof us, or to give us an advantage in the development of future vaccines against the new variants, which have not necessarily been studied in the challenge trials. So overall, I felt that the benefits of at least this first wave of trials were insufficiently clear to justify the risks. And I think that given the very high stakes involved, the onus of proof for establishing what the benefits are that are going to be realised from the research, so not just we will know more, but what are the public health benefits that that's going to lead to, and the pathway by which that research is going to produce those benefits. The onus of demonstrating that, I think, needs to be on the researchers. Some of the criticism at the time around the UK trials were that they were insufficiently transparent about their protocol, but I think we need to call for equal transparency when it comes to what's this research meant to do, why, what are the benefits, and why do they justify the risks. Okay, a bonus extra thought. So I questioned the timeliness of the current round of challenge trials, and I said, well, we already have vaccines. The bonus extra thought, of course, is whether, even though the challenge trials that started in February didn't necessarily help us develop the vaccines we have now any faster, is promoting the challenge trials, establishing the lines of ethical arguments that might support them, and also attempting to gain public acceptance for challenge trials, public acceptance for it's all right to infect people with coronavirus. Is this actually a form of building ethical or maybe unethical preparedness for future pandemic crises? So these trials were too late for the first wave of COVID variants and vaccines, but will the payoff come later when we don't have to debate and we can just say, look, we've done it before. We've done challenge trials before, let's go in swinging, let's get vaccines. Okay, I don't have time to explore that further now, but I thought I would drop in there for people to reflect on. Let me move on then to the section of my talk about differential vaccine allocation. And this is yet another case in which I think we need to look at the way that we are evaluating risks and using that in making decisions about public health policy and healthcare and research policy as well. So it was great that we got a vaccine for coronavirus so fast. So towards the end of last year, as it became clear that we were going to have vaccines that happened pretty soon, one of the big success stories was it took us less than a year to get to a COVID vaccine. But of course, we didn't have just a vaccine, we had many vaccines. And so therefore, and I have cribbed this picture, which is, I think, clearly photoshopped off somewhere on the internet. But it's fine. Okay, so late last year, those of us who were looking at this were also saying, well, hang on, it's great that we have vaccines, but the availability of different vaccines and the fact that they are going to have different safety and efficacy profiles, different adverse effects, different availability, different national interests backing them or not backing them, all of this is going to create a very complex landscape for eventual vaccine distribution. I think we saw, well, we have seen and continue to see some of the global dynamics and the international politics of medical innovation play out in terms of which vaccines get made available where, and now particularly with schemes for vaccine certification coming in, the possibility that actually there will be forms of vaccine nationalism in terms of favouring certain vaccines based not only on scientific evidence but also on national interest. But that's not what I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about is, the way that we handled the different risk profiles associated with the vaccines. I won't talk so much about possible differences in efficacy, although those, of course, have also been on people's minds and might inform individual opinions, and if we had the choice, might inform individual decision making. Most of us in the UK have not necessarily had the choice. But so they would inform both about how as individuals we regard the prospect of getting vaccinated at a given time in a given place. For example, just to give a personal example, I know that in Edinburgh, different vaccination centres were said to be giving out different vaccines, and so if you wanted one or the other, you had to know which centre to go to. I went to the one closest to me that had an appointment, but these are the sorts of things that people are thinking about. So the main vaccine candidates that were being made available in the UK in the early part of this year were the AstraZeneca vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. We have had some of the others be available, but the main discourse, if you like, and the main choice, not that there was much choice, was between should you have this one or the other one. And as we all know, the rollout was going reasonably successfully, but then in around March or April of this year, concerns started to emerge over adverse events associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine, specifically a rare clotting disorder that had been observed in a very, very small number of AstraZeneca recipients. And I believe I saw this reported first from Germany, but rapidly reports emerged from different countries of small numbers of these adverse events in people who received the AstraZeneca vaccine. As a result, several countries suspended their rollout, so a decision was made at a sort of higher level to wait and to pause and to reevaluate. So the EMA did an evaluation of the safety of the vaccine. Beyond that as well, though, we need to think that not only at a sort of public health level, decisions were made about whether to hold back on the rollout, but also that this news and the way that it was reported will have had some impact on people and their willingness, their eagerness, or their hesitancy to be vaccinated. So this news may well have slowed some people down by a week, a month, a couple of months from going to get vaccinated because of concerns. Very common, and again anecdotally, very common amongst people I know. I might just wait a little bit longer and see. We're not really sure yet. And again, bearing in mind those claims about the longer we delay people being vaccinated, even if it is by a month or a few weeks, that could still be costing lives. So this concern over the risks associated probably did hold up the process of vaccination rollout, and that may have had real consequences in terms of human life and health. So in the wake of thinking that AstraZeneca perhaps had particular risks associated with it, a number of health authorities in different countries decided to change their policy on vaccine allocation. And yeah, when I was searching for the advice on this, I didn't find the document that I originally wanted to find, which had actually the table comparing what they thought the relative risks were. But our JCVI in the UK in April issued the guidance that certain age groups, so under 30s, as well as those 30 to 39-year-old who are not in a clinical priority group at higher risk of severe COVID, should be offered an alternative to AstraZeneca. And they said that that was based on available data on current epidemiology, benefit risk profile by age, and I've highlighted that because that's, I think, the key factor that I want to look at. Modeling predictions on disease trends and the current forecast on vaccine supply. So they thought we were going to be able to get alternative vaccines in good time, and therefore we should be able to offer alternatives. So if I've understood it correctly, and this is still research in progress in a sense, so I'm still trying to bottom out some of the facts in this. My understanding of the way that these decisions were being made at the time was that the recommendation that younger age groups should be offered an alternative was based on different background risks for different age and disease status groups of getting COVID and getting severe illness from it. So in other words, they were treating the risk of an adverse event, particularly the risk of clotting, as a fixed figure across all groups. But they were saying in some cases, if you're very young, your risk of getting COVID actually falls below that, and therefore would recommend an alternative. Whereas if you're older, you're at a higher risk, and therefore the risk of adverse events is lower than your background risk. Have I explained that in a way that makes sense to everyone? Yeah, so it wasn't based on different risk of adverse effects. It wasn't based on if you're 60, you have a less risk of clotting, and if you're 20, you have a greater risk of clotting. It's based on if you're 60, you have a greater risk of COVID, and therefore your relative risk profile is more favourable to give you a supposedly riskier treatment. Now, I think there were a lot of I think there are a lot of problems with the whole way that this that these adverse events and the evaluation of what the risks actually were reported and thought about, and there was quite a lot of ethical discussion at the time, saying we really shouldn't be pausing. The kinds of magnitudes of the risk we're talking about are so small that actually we're doing far more harm by pausing than by just carrying on. And I think that's basically right. So it was extremely low numbers of events that were reported, even to the point where it was hard to say whether this was an adverse effect or just something that was happening at a background rate. As I said, the risk-benefit balance was still, I think, in favour of vaccination overall. And to me, one of the biggest concerns is that the reporting of these effects, I think it's undoubted that it did to some extent increase vaccine hesitancy or vaccine delay over people who were slated to receive the AstraZeneca vaccine. And that's the case even, I would say, among groups who wouldn't be considered traditionally hesitant. So people who you might think would be enthusiastic about vaccines, would say, yes, I think that we should be vaccinated. But then they might have said, well, but maybe I'll just wait. And again, anecdotally, I saw this quite a lot on social media amongst younger, well-educated groups who you would not think of as necessarily being traditionally, what we'd say, called vaccinated. I think there were further, if we look on the international scene, there were questions about which figures ought to be used for risk calculation. So the rates at which these events were being detected and reported were quite variable amongst different populations. I think a lot of what I saw was public health authorities within given countries using the rate per vaccination in their country to decide what the risk was. So I think at one point the UK was talking about 1 in 100,000. I think at the same time Australia was talking about 1 in 250,000. So using different rates based on what had occurred within their particular population. I think for whatever reason Germany had a proportionally higher rate even than the UK, and so they were more sceptical about it. But when we're talking about such low numbers, I mean, I think that there are reasons to rely more on your own in-country data, because there could be environmental and population reasons why populations in the UK versus Australia might respond differently. But with such low numbers, it might just also be statistical errors. So is it valid to perform the kind of comparative risk calculations that were what was being talked about at the time? You know, your risk of getting endive from COVID is this, your risk of getting blood clot is this, 1 in 50,000 is more than 1 in 100,000, so you should have the vaccine. Is it valid to be doing that kind of comparison when you've actually got such tiny numbers and really still such a paucity of data? So I think there are a lot of problems even with recognising this as a risk event and the way it was responded to by public health authorities in terms of what they then did with vaccination. But a number of countries did introduce age-based stratification for different vaccines. So that was then rolled back on in quite a number of cases. But to begin with, the policy tended to be, well, you're a high-risk older adult, you can have the high-risk vaccine. I think that's fundamentally problematic. And here's why I think it is. So there's a thought experiment that I call botulism on the beach. It's not very complicated, but imagine we're shipwrecked on an island. Me and you, Doug, are shipwrecked on an island. We've only got 2 crates of tin food. One's been contaminated with botulism, and if you eat tin food from that, it's a 30% chance that you're going to die. Our chance of rescue within the next month are slim. A container ship might pass by, but we reckon it might be a month before we're rescued. Now, I'm happily overweight, and I reckon I can probably survive the month. I can go half rations. But Doug's not. Doug is fighting fit, but can't survive a month without food. So he'll probably starve if he doesn't eat some of the tin food. How do we allocate the crates? Now, if we were to go with that approach of relative risk, my risk of eating the contaminated food is higher than my risk of just waiting out the month. So you might say, well, you know, Doug's almost certainly going to die. Let's give him the crate with the botulism, because 30% chance is better than almost certain death, and I'll have the safe food. But I don't think that's fair, right? I don't think that is the right way to allocate the crates of food in this circumstance. So it's a bit of a silly thought experiment, but it kind of gets to my intuitive, I don't feel that's the right response about saying you're at a higher background risk, so we'll give you the riskier treatment. We'll give you and I hesitate to say this because I don't actually think that the AstraZeneca treatment was in any way second best. I think the sorts of risks we were talking about were so small that the debate was almost nugatory. But it did raise this question of, is it right to say, well, you're at a higher risk, so we'll give you the riskier treatment, and we'll preferentially allocate the less risky treatment to those who have less background risk of disease, those who are probably going to survive anyway. So I don't think that it's just to do that. I think that by saying that, you're placing the burden of the higher risk treatment on those who are already disadvantaged in terms of the existing background risk. Please tell me if this is just, you know, am I missing something huge, or is this blindingly obvious? But I was just like, I don't think this is right, what they're suggesting. Now, it might be in some cases justified to differentially allocate different treatments to different populations if the actual risk of adverse effects themselves were different. And I started trying to think of ways to extend my thought experiment and to say, well, what if I'm resistant to botulism, etc. And then it just all became very silly. But If the actual risk of whatever adverse effect we were worried about was lower in the older population, then it would probably be justified to do that. And then the other situation in which it might be justified to give someone a second best treatment when they're in a higher risk group, that might be justified if the group who is scheduled to receive the second best treatment just has no other option. And that doesn't mean being given no other option. It doesn't mean the JCVI said you can only have this one. But if there, for whatever reason, if there is actually no other option than a second best, then it could be ethically justified to give them that. Now, the ethics of second best treatments and the idea of minimal risk has been explored in relation to medical research. And I'm thinking particularly of the Kennedy-Krieger lead paint contamination case. I think it's not an easy one, and I think that there can sometimes be good reasons to both carry out research on second best, especially where there is no other option, and it can be sometimes justified to give second best. I don't think that only on the basis of risk is that case. But then I also want to say that the whole relative risk in AstraZeneca was a bit of a risk furphy, and that we oughtn't to be talking about the treatments in terms of best and second best. But other factors that this brings up, further problems with the idea that we're going to look at background risk and allocate people to receive different vaccines based on background risk, is that it's a very narrow approach. And I did see a lot of justifications and figures at the time giving numbers. The risk is 1 in 100,000. So really relying on the numbers there. But background risk is also dependent on a whole host of other factors, including either existing or prospective public health policies. So Australia particularly, Australia, because they had different numbers of clotting cases and they had a different background risk to the UK, had a slightly different policy to begin with on who should receive AstraZeneca. So they, I think, said nobody under 50, I'm doing that off the top of my head, I hope that's right. But their age threshold was higher because their evaluation of both the background risk and the risk of adverse effects was different. And so they first said nobody under the age of 50. Now, of course, what's your background risk? I said that the background risk of contracting COVID in Australia was lower, both because of the population size and the incidence of COVID, but also because they were having very severe lockdowns and also not letting anybody into or out of the country. Now, okay, so what your background risk is what it is, but that can change. Where was the evaluation, for example, of how much would the risk go up were we to open up international travel? How much would that change the background risk, and how does that have a bearing on our decisions about which vaccines to allocate? So the Australian Health Ministry came under quite severe criticism for holding back a little bit on the vaccine rollout, when in fact they didn't take into account would people prefer to be less locked down and more able to travel and very slightly more at risk from a vaccine that wasn't being made as available. Okay, so there are other public health policies to think about, that the simple comparison of 1 in 100,000, 1 in 50,000, the simple comparison of numbers of existing risks just totally fails to take that into account. Of course, another thing that conditions what the background risk is the rate of vaccination itself. So we're talking here, background risk is not only the risk to yourself, but the risk you pose to other people. And the percentage of the population who are vaccinated affects what that background risk is. So any measures that encourage some of the population to put off vaccination or reduce the availability of vaccination to the population are going to increase the background risk for everybody. And that's going to have a feedback effect, right, on whether or not you decide to make vaccination available. So there was not really, I think, an evaluation of the wider factors that contribute to what the background risk is, and a thinking about what public health policies as a whole should feed into what the vaccination policy is. Something else that affects the background risk, this affects the risk of the adverse effects, awareness that they exist and timely treatment. So once it started to be known that there was this very rare possible side effect, and they started issuing, here's the set of symptoms to look out for, your chance of dying from that probably went down. So all of these things needed to be factored in, but I don't think they sufficiently were. Okay, so I think I'm getting almost to the end of my time. So let me move on then to what can we draw from looking at these two cases for thinking about how we treat relative risks in setting pandemic public health policy. So to summarize so far, I have tried to argue that I think the risks of deliberately exposing volunteers to COVID in at least the current iterations of challenge trials in the UK aren't justified by the supposed benefits. And I've tried to argue that the risks of adverse effects from vaccines don't justify stratifying the allocation of treatments based on different levels of background risk. So I've argued that, and yet challenge trials have been approved, and in a number of countries, they did stratify vaccine allocation and say AstraZeneca for younger people, you can't have that. So this to me just presents a bit of a puzzle. Why is it acceptable to expose healthy young people to a significantly higher risk of undergoing challenge trials with the justification being, well, we're going to develop vaccines and vaccines are good. But then when the vaccines come out, we don't want to expose younger people to the much smaller risk of having the vaccine. Now, the pragmatic but unsatisfactory explanation for this apparent paradox is that decisions about vaccine allocation and decisions about research approval get made in totally different ways by different bits of our policy making bodies. And of course, that's not joined up. And this is why we have what looks like a bit of a paradox. So that's pragmatic, but it's not really very satisfactory. We could try and think of some possible differences that mean that we can't just compare the two cases like this. So we might say, well, challenge trial participants are low risk for COVID, so we are trying to reduce the risk. But the comparison of the relative risk in the process of vaccine approval or vaccine recommendation is with the overall background risk. So it's not just the chance that you get sick if you catch COVID, it also factors in what's the chance that you catch COVID in the first place. The risk involved in challenge trials is much higher, so you're probably going to get infected. The point of the challenge trial is they try to infect you. So the actual risk of challenge trials is still higher. We might say, well, it's different because challenge trials are research and people have volunteered for this and it's aimed at generating knowledge, whereas vaccines are treatment and our expectations around risk in exposure to treatment and whether or not people have properly consented and whether they can be said to have volunteered to undertake the risk are different when they think they're receiving the therapy. But in a sense, in many senses indeed, the rollout of novel vaccines during a pandemic is both research and healthcare or treatment. So we're generating evidence on vaccine safety and efficacy through the rollout. And that's in fact the way in which we're identifying some of the rarer side effects or some of the data around the sort of duration of immunity and so forth. So vaccines, that rollout of vaccines in the pandemic is also research. I think there's surely more justification for it than for the challenge trial research alone. So it's a trial, even if not such a controlled one, it's on a much bigger scale. There's the potential to generate much more evidence and there's a therapeutic benefit. So surely there's more justification for that. And then we might say, well, the consent given to participate in a challenge trial differs from the consent to vaccination. As I said, we might think that volunteering to participate in a challenge trial means you're more informed. We might have different patient and participant expectations. But consent is irrelevant when it comes to vaccine allocation. Now, I did say if people had choices, that various factors might influence their choices, but in fact, most of us aren't really given a choice. We receive the vaccine that is allocated to our age group, or we don't get vaccinated. So when the decisions about who gets what vaccine are made at a higher level, there's no option to consent. There's no option to consent to undertaking the risk of the more dangerous treatment. So I wondered whether it might be instructive to think about that ethical framework that we saw for challenge trials and to see how that pans out when it comes to vaccine allocation. So remember, this is what sorts of things would make a challenge trial ethical. So is there sufficient scientific and social value? Well, there's clear social and public health value in vaccination. And as long as the overall risk-benefit balance of vaccination is favourable, that continues to be the case, which it was. Fair subject selection. I've pointed out that I think there's a problem of fairness in allocation if you give higher risk treatments to higher risk groups. And is there an acceptable risk-benefit balance? Well, again, I think in the case of vaccination, the absolute risks from vaccination themselves were very, very tiny. The risks of challenge trials were much higher. And there was also a failure to consider the wider public health context that affected what those risks were, what the risk-benefit balance would be. Informed consent, as I said, you can't consent if you're not offered the treatment. And I think Australia finally got this partly right, because after for a while saying, no, you can't have it if you're under 50, they went to saying, oh, well, actually you can have it if you've talked to your GP and you are properly informed about it. But they got it a bit wrong because they insisted on introducing all sorts of extra regulations around, oh, well, doctors shouldn't be sued if they give it to you and you have a clot, and by exceptionalizing it in a way, by saying, oh, but you must be properly informed. I think they actually may have contributed to the scaremongering around AstraZeneca, and that probably, again, would have led to people not having the treatment they otherwise would have. When it comes to stakeholder engagement, I think the messaging on risks, when we talk about vaccines and about adverse effects, the messaging has been pretty poor. I think people are much more scared about clots from AstraZeneca than they ought to be. And no matter how many infographics you see on being eaten by a shark and struck by lightning, that just doesn't seem to, that doesn't seem to sink in. But I think, and this is something I've said in my work for the Pandemic Ethics Accelerator elsewhere, there was a lack of engagement with publics on which risks matter in what ways. So, do people, yeah, you might be more likely to be struck by lightning than die from a blood clot after AstraZeneca. But would you rather be struck by lightning? Would you rather not have to say, oh, I wish I hadn't had that vaccine? So risks are not just about numbers, risks aren't created equal. And there was also a lack of engagement on the other factors that condition risk, particularly the other public health policies and how those intersect with a vaccination plan for a given country. Okay, so a few conclusions. I'm just about to finish. I think the conclusions from my individual analyses about challenge trials with Emma and the analysis of vaccine policy, I think challenge trials need much more careful justification, especially when it comes to the benefits that are claimed and how they've been realised. I think, and I apologise if this was just a no-brainer, but allocating higher risk groups to higher risk treatments may be unethical. In many cases it is. But overall, when we compare these two cases, I think it's clear that in pandemic public health policy, we need a much more joined up approach. So we need a more joined up approach to evaluating and distributing risk across all aspects of public health, not just between research and treatment, but also across other public health policies such as behavioural interventions, masking, lockdowns, travel restrictions, etc. We also need a more joined up approach to knowledge production. So we need to recognise more explicitly that the rollout of treatments continues to be research, and to think about what that means for the people who are receiving those treatments as research participants. We need to be connecting the collection and use of real-world evidence with our research aims. So if challenge trials are designed to address a particular research aim, could real-world evidence do the same? And that is all I have for you today. Thank you very much for your attention.